and we'll get into the content. Okay, so today's session is the search configuration session. We're going to look at some of the configuration elements for the your local searches, your basic and advanced searches. We're also going to take a look at some ranking configuration, actually do more of it in Alma and see how the effects, what effects we have in our Primo V. And then next week, we're going to talk about, get into configuring the newspaper search, the collection discovery, the database discovery, all of that kind of thing. So that's what we'll be focusing on next week. And then we'll be getting into more of the display stuff, the branding and then display configuration in Alma. So that's what's upcoming. And here we are at search configuration. So in today's session, we're going to go over search configuration in Primo, which the sort of meat and bones of it is the search scopes, the profiles, and the search slots. We'll also take a look at the ways that you can configure your basic and advanced searches. And we'll also look again at ranking and blending and also see how they affect results, at least in this sandbox environment, sort of get a feel for if you make changes, what actually happens. And then we'll also look at the actual configuration elements for restricted user groups that we saw mentioned last week. We'll show how to actually configure those things if you wanted to put that into place in your environment. So starting with the search scopes, the profiles, and the slots. So I'm going to kind of talk through it and then show it in V, and hopefully that will sort of solidify the understanding of it. It's kind of hard, I think, to explain. It sounds, to me, it sounds like I'm not being very clear, but hopefully once we see the setup in V, it will become more clear. So the smallest piece, there's sort of a hierarchy of the way that these are built, and the smallest piece is the scope. And the scope is what is actually deciding what groups of records meet specific criteria that you set, and deciding what records from your database or from CDI, are they coming from CDI, are they coming from your library? What are you actually searching? So you're setting the criteria of what's being searched in the scope. So scopes can be combined, they can sit by themselves. They're basically not put into use until they're put into a search profile, and they're not seen in the UI until they're put into a search profile slot. So they must be included in a search profile in order to be put into use. So without being put into a search profile, it's sort of just like an exercise in dividing up your records, but you need to put the scope into a search profile in order to use it anywhere. Um, Scopes can be used in one or more search profiles. So if you create a scope, it can be reused. It can be contained in many search profiles. It can be contained in only one. And again, it cannot be used also. It could just be something that you've created and is not contained in a search profile. The search profile, I sort of think of it as the container for the scopes. So the search profile contains scopes, and it's showing the groups of records that are basically used to search. So it must contain at least one scope, otherwise it's just the empty container, but it can also contain multiple scopes. So it's combining those scopes of records together so that you're searching what you intend to. And several search profiles can be configured for an institution. So, for example, you might have many search profiles, some that search specific libraries, some that search specific collections, some that are searching everything. You're pretty much unlimited also in terms of how many search profiles you can create. And again, search profiles are only put into play when they're actually put into the search profile slot, which is the final piece. So you have your search profile slot, and that's actually in the view configuration. So you're deciding per view which search profiles you're displaying to your users. So this is what's actually used to narrow down or target the searches that your user is seeing. It's also a way to help you divide the data into different sections in your Primo V view. And it's the thing that's visible to the user when they start typing their query. So when you start typing your search and you see like everything, articles, library catalog, those are the search profile slots. And what you name those and what search profiles are powering that slot, those are your choices that you're making in configuration. Your search profile slot can contain one or more search profiles. That has some implications for how it displays, and we'll see that in a second. And your view can contain one or more search slots. So some folks tend to set up their Primo V view more like a Google search where you have one single search profile and you don't have that drop down aspect at all. So you can have just one search profile, one search slot with one search profile, or you can have any number of drop down sort of configurations so that you can refine it with your different search profiles and scopes. So let's actually take a look at that. So in terms of what you see, again, in V, if you are searching for something, you have your drop downs here, and we've seen this before. These are your search profile slots that is actually displaying to your users. Of course, that's also replicated in here. So when we actually get to the search profile slots, that's what's building these drop downs here. The everything search profile slot, I'll try to use the right language as much as I can. So I see that there's only one search profile here. And the reason I can see that is because there's only one drop down here. So let me show you what that means in a second. So I have only one thing to choose in this drop down for the everything scope. And then I've already, I'm able to search right there. And my search profile might contain multiple scopes, but that's not visible to me in the user interface. That's only visible in Alma to see what scopes are in this search profile. If you have multiple search profiles in your search slot, it will appear like this. So the library search slot has multiple search profiles. So I get this double drop down where the second drop down appears on the right side of the search slot. So here I'm saying I've created this search slot called libraries, and now I can search these search profiles here, of which there are three: the main library, the graduate library, and the law library. So if I selected graduate library, now I'm searching only the graduate library, well, presumably that's how it's named at least, um, underneath this sort of umbrella of libraries. Now, I know that some folks tend to, or at least I've talked to libraries that really dislike this like sort of double drop down, and they don't like it in terms of user interface or usability. And there are other ways to configure this if you don't like how this looks, but just sort of visually showing before we go into Alma that this is how it appears if you have multiple search profiles in your slot. So this is what your user ends up seeing. So we're going to go into Alma at this point, and we're going to take a look at the configuration of our search profiles. And I'll be switching back and forth between the regular Alma menu, which is black. So this is the regular Alma menu before you go into configuration. And then we also have the config menu. And when I'm in the config menu, this bar is blue. And I get more options for discovery here. They're actually under a slider in this case. But just for clarity, I'll be going back and forth. And some of the pieces are under both the regular and the config menus, and then some pieces are only under the config menu. But we are going to go to search profiles. So that's always under search configuration in your discovery menu, search profiles. And here I can see all of the search profiles that are set up for my institution. There are quite a few here. A lot of these are out of the box though, and we've seen them before, like the articles search profile, articles and more, that's showing only the central index records. We have course reserves, that's also out of the box, comes by default, and it's showing your local data, and it's showing all of your records that are linked to an active course. We have this graduate library, law library, and main library, and these were created, so these were added not out of the box, and of course they represent those libraries that we saw in this drop down here: main, graduate, and law. We have everything that's also out of the box, and this is blended, and we'll talk about the configuring the blending later, but this is including both institutional records, local records, and your records coming from the central index or CDI. And then the last one that's out of the box is the library catalog, which is all of your local records belonging to your institution. And we see that we have other search profiles that have been created for various reasons in this sandbox. And again, you can have, infinitely many number of these as you need or want or play around with, and they can or don't have to be actually utilized in a view. So if we wanted to add an additional search profile, so we have graduate, law, and main here, but there's also a music library at this institution. So if I wanted to add a search profile that had the scope of music library, we can add a search profile. And to start, you have to give it a code. And so it's remembering what I've typed before. So I'm going to give it a code and a display name. And then I have a description here, and this will show up when you hover over. You don't have to have a description. It can help also when you're trying to choose which search profile you want to put in your search profile slot. It can help to give a description so you remember what is actually contained in here. So as I mentioned, the search profile is kind of the middle piece of architecture. It's the container for your scopes. So this is not doing anything, it's not searching anything until we add the scope. So when you add scope here, you have a lot of out-of-the-box options here. If you have like campuses set up at your institution, the campuses that you have defined will be pulled in here. There's the same thing with the libraries. So if you have multiple libraries at your institution, they're already automatically pulled in. You have your custom local data scopes. The custom local data we'll talk about in 1 second, with the same thing with other indexes. So these are things that you need to do additional configuration work to define. You also have your entire institution, all of your local records, and you also have the central index, so you can create your own blended scope that contains CDI records and some subset potentially of your local data. If you do choose the central index, if you choose that as your scope type, you get this filter by availability, and this is where you're choosing whether or not you are filtering by only what you have full text access to or not. So basically, if you leave this checked, you're automatically getting only what you have full text access to in CDI. So you're not checking this box, in other words. And if you leave this unchecked, you're basically checking this expand my results by default. So you do have the option to make choices about that when you add the central index scope. So I'm going to add actually the library. I meant to add the music library here. So I can add and close. And then you see that I can add additional scopes. So if I wanted to search the music library with the science library together, I combine those scopes in order to create what I want in this search profile. In this case, I'm just going to leave it with the one scope. I do want to mention, so this is a different ALMA environment. This ALMA environment is part of a network zone. So this one is part of a consortia, and just to show, there's a few differences, and this one has tended to be a little slow, but when you add a scope, if you're part of a network zone, you do have the option to add your entire network. That's in addition to your entire institution. And I'll also show some differences in the custom local data scopes also. So that's basically what's out of the box in terms of adding scopes to your search profiles. And this is where you would add any search profiles that you needed to use in your slots. You can also, if you wanted to do something more refined than everything from a certain campus, anything from a certain library, you can create your own custom local data scopes. And these can be used to, I'm actually going to delete this one because I want to recreate it. You can use these to sort of pinpoint more specific pieces of your local data that you might want to search. So let's take a look at that. So if you wanted to add a custom local data scope, Again, you have to define a code, and we're going to try and target our Maps of China collection in this particular example. So again, I'm giving it a code, I'm giving it a name, I'm giving it a description, and I'm actually building the scope that then will be contained in our search profile. So we need to add conditions. And so, and I'm sorry that this sort of appears really close to the bottom and it's not a great view, but you see that you have up to 3 conditions that you can define. And you can grab those conditions from a few different places. So you can use inventory. So you can use like, oops, is it available digital? So this is referring to if you have Alma D. Is it available electronically? So your electronic collections, your local electronic collections, etc. Is it physical material? You can limit by, your P records, your E records. Does it have a course? So you can add a course component to your scope, um, part of a collection. A popular thing to use obviously is location. So instead of having your scope search again an entire library or campus, you can refine it further to a particular location. If you have defined certain local fields, like here we have audience and donated by, and we'll talk about it more in the local data session. You can use those local fields as part of your scoping. So again, this is refining what set of records we're actually searching. And then the final piece you can search is you can use metadata from the bib record itself. So, I mean, I guess you could get like really small in terms of the set, and you're only searching for a specific like title or creator or ISBN. And then you can make further refinements about what records are actually being pulled back in that search. Knowing, of course, that your users have, additional faceting if you didn't want to create a really restricted scope, that there are other ways to narrow down to these specific types of data. Resource type is another, you could narrow it down by resource type, specific, you know, maps in this case. So I can actually add my condition here for defining my Maps of China collection. So if I wanted to narrow that down, for example, I could choose resource type. And again, this is coming from the bib record based on what's coded in the bib in terms of resource type equals maps. And I can add, of course, up to 3 conditions. So here's my first one. And then I can add additional. And I'm also going to add language. And again, this metadata is coming from the bib. And then I have my operator here. So I have equals and not equals. So I have that refinement also. So I can choose Chinese language. And then I have my logic. So I can and or this statement to my previous statement. And I'm going to add one more condition. So I'm going to add an inventory condition, and I'm actually going to add inventory specific location. And it's remembering what I've chosen before. That's why it's appearing on top. But I'm looking at the main library. I'm looking at only the international collection location. So adding that. And so now we see that instead of searching an entire library, we're searching just those resources that are maps that are in the Chinese language that are in the location of international collection. And we can save that. And once you've created a custom local data scope, you're defining those records that you're searching, but in order to put this into use, it needs to be contained in a search profile. So once you've created your custom local data scope, then you'll add your search profile. You'd give it a name, give it a code, and when you come in to add scope, rather than using like my campuses or my libraries, you can choose now custom local data. And when you choose that, then you can choose the scope that you've created. So here I can choose Maps of China, and then I can add and close. And of course, I can then combine this scope, this custom local scope that I've created with other scopes if necessary, to create the search profile. So there's also the option to define other indexes. So if you're interested in setting up the EBSCO API search or the WorldCat API search, you can do that here. The EBSCO one. So if you want to make a live API call to EBSCO, you can do that. You need to have your username, which generally is structured kind of like this from EBSCO, and you need to have a password. You also need to have the list of databases that you subscribe to, and this is kind of what they look like. They're the codes for the databases from the EBSCO vendor. And well, a few things to note about the EBSCO API search. One is that this list of databases always needs to be kept up to date. If there's any databases here to which you don't subscribe to anymore, or access has changed, or something like that, the API call will fail, and it doesn't give you any information really about why. Generally, it's because you've lost access to one of those databases. And it's every time I've set this up for somebody, there's always at least a few databases that aren't being searched at that time. So they have to be removed from the list. So it's kind of a labor-intensive thing. If you're interested in setting it up, you can let me know in the chat. There's some ways that there's some tools. They're not like, you still need to do some manual work, but they help you decide what databases you need to remove from your list so that the call doesn't fail. The other thing to note about the EBSCO API search is that EBSCO doesn't allow faceting to be pulled back. So all of the good faceting that you have here on the side that's helping you refine your search results, you would not get from the EBSCO search. And if you combine this scope with another scope, like, people have the idea, I'm going to combine the EBSCO scope with CDI, with my institution, so that my users can search everything, including making this API search. That breaks faceting for the other scopes it's combined with. So if you want to use it, the recommendation is always to put it in its own search profile slot. So you'd have like libraries, course reserves, and then you'd have like EBSCO here, and you would search it on its own. That would be my recommendation. And the same thing with the WorldCat search. You need to have your WorldCat API key, and I'd also recommend that you'd keep it in its own scope. In terms of other things you can do here in other indexes, you can also define a deep search. Deep search allows you um, to search another institution's Primo V, and you need their environment details in order to set this up. And then you can also define a webhook. And there's some documentation at the end of this slideshow on how you can do that. It's beyond what we're going to show here, but you can do that. And so you can search special union catalogs and external databases like Project Gutenberg and Access World News, etc. Um, so those
Laura,
are other options. Yes,
we have a few related questions.
sure.
So the first one is someone asked about the description field that is on the page when you are defining a local scope. If you can clarify if that when you hover over that, you mentioned that it displays like the description displays. I believe that's in Primo V when you're hovering over the drop down. Is that what you meant?
Um, maybe I misspoke because I think that this description appears when you're choosing it in the search profile slot, and I think you can put a description in the search profile slot that then appears when you hover over in Primo V, but we can take a look at that when we get there. I think this is more to remind yourself of what you've done, what's contained in here, so that you can choose the right scope.
Mhm. The other question was about which roles are needed to edit discoveries, like these search profiles and scopes. It should just be the discovery admin role, correct?
Yes. Yep.
Let me see if we have any other questions. We have another question. They asked if a custom scope can be set up so that it limits results to like certain database vendors. Let's say if you want certain collections or only certain like data from certain collections or portfolios from a certain collection to be in that particular scope, if that's possible.
You can use, let me just clear conditions. So you can use, I believe, in a certain collection. I'm not sure is part of any collection. Let's see, I think there's, oh, I hate that it's so far down. It's part of any collection, is part of collection, sub-collection. So you can, the collections that are displaying here aren't like the collections coming from the community zone. These are collections that are part of the collection discovery that we'll look at next week. So you could create a top level collection in the collection discovery area, like we have Birds of North America. So you could include like only a certain vendor in that collection or a certain provider or something, if that's the question, in a top level collection. And then you can use the inventory as part of a collection sub collection and then choose that. And you can use that as a custom local data scope, but it's not as easy as just choosing you know, like Gale virtual library. You'd have to put the Gale virtual library into a top level collection in order for that to be useful. And I think you have to select by bib. Ugh, so it might be kind of rough, but technically possible. So that's search profiles and scopes. Um, so once you have those defined how you want with your scopes inside of your search profiles and you have them defined and named appropriately, at that point you can put them into the search slots, which is actually going to define what your user sees in the view. So I'm going to go back into the discovery menu and I'm going to go into display configuration and configure views. There's a big long list of views here. We'll talk more about the view code and the way it's structured when we get into the CSS and HTML branding session. Um, but again, you can have as many views as you want. You can create them for testing. They don't have to be public facing. Each view has its own URL associated with it. And you just have to have one as a default. And really the only thing that the default view does is when you're in Alma and when you send a record to discovery, like when you go to the record options and say view and discovery, it's always going to open in your default view. But other than that, you can have multiple, you can have multiple views that are public facing with just one chosen as the default. In any case, I'm going to look at this view. This is the default one and also the one we've been looking at. When we get into edit, we'll be spending a lot of time in the view configuration as we go forward. But we're going to look right now at the third tab, which is search profile slots. So here, most of these are out of the box and we've seen them before. The everything, library catalog, articles, and course reserves. And here I think is where the description actually is potentially viewable to your user. So you can put a description in the search slot itself. So if you create a new view, you'll see these ones come up by default. This one is the one that we've created. And you see that most of these have only one single search profile contained in them. So that search profile, again, might contain multiple scopes, but there's only one profile defined for these, except for this one. So this one has multiple. And we remember that when you do that, that's creating this multiple drop-down situation. So let's take a look at that one. Um, so this search profile slot has multiple search profiles turned on for it that are active. So when you define a search profile slot, when you get down to this select search profiles for slot, you'll see everything that you've defined in that previous page in terms of search profiles. And we should see, yeah, my music library, which we just created, which is all material belonging to the music library. In order to put this into play, I just need to slide the slider. And you do have to save here. In some parts of the view configuration, you don't have to save. In some places you do. So just, I guess, look up to the right to see if there is that save button. And then as soon as you do that, if you refresh your page, you should automatically see the change. So I should see that that music library is included in my search bar. So if I go back to libraries, I should see now that I also am able to search my music library, which is the search profile that we had just defined. Also to note, if you don't want something to display in your user interface in the list, you can just toggle it off. You don't have to delete it, although you can. You can delete the row. But once you toggle this off to deactivate it, basically, it won't appear anymore in your list. And just by refreshing it, you should be able to see that change put into place. So now course reserves is gone. So it's just as easy as that. And that is really defining your search profiles. And again, if you wanted to search like the main library, the grad library, the music library separately, but you didn't like the double drop down, but you didn't like the double drop down, what you could do is you could create multiple search profile slots and then only put one search profile in each, and then they would all appear in this list together rather than having this additional drop down. So just some different ways depending on what you think is most useful for your users to search for in Primo V. So that is basically search scopes, profiles, and search profile slots. So we're going to take a look again at actually configuring some of the basic and advanced search options. So if I go back to search in the everything scope, and I'm going to search again for that heart attack search. And when I start typing anything, really, we know that I get these suggestions here. We've seen this before. We know this is coming from the autocomplete functionality. The autocomplete functionality can be turned on or off. And again, these are suggestions that are coming from the top searches for your local and CDI searches from your institution. If you want to turn that off, you can turn that off in the view configuration. So right now we're in search profile slots. If you go to the first tab, general, you have this autocomplete enabled here. If you want to turn that off, you just unclick the checkbox and then you save, and then that should be gone for this view. So you do have the option, and we'll talk about some of these other options that you have on the general tab in the view. And anything that you do in the view configuration, you can do for each view. So you can have this turned on for one view that you have and turn it off for another one. Some things, like the thing we'll see next, you can't define per view. It's institution-wide. So we also know that when we search for heart attack, as we've seen before, we have the controlled vocabulary service that's bringing us the myocardial infarction results also. If you don't want to show that to your users, you can hide that feature. It's in a little bit of a different place. You actually have to go into the configuration menu under discovery. So you have to be in config, so your bar is blue. You go into discovery menu, and then the last section, and sort of mine is like a scroll down, but sometimes it sort of spreads this way across the page depending on what kind of screen you have. But under the other section, you have this customer settings, kind of like halfway down or so. And this is a mapping table, so this affects your entire institution. Not autocomplete. Use controlled vocabulary service. So there's this parameter, and if I scroll over it, you can see it's called use controlled vocabulary search expansion. And it's set to true. And if you wanted to turn that off, you didn't want to use the controlled vocabulary, you would have to go into this row and click on customize. And then that will open up the parameter value here for you to change it. And you would type in false, and then you would save this mapping table. Similarly, if you didn't want to have the synonym feature enabled, there is this disable synonyms, and that's set to false. So we're not disabling synonyms. And if you wanted to disable them, you would turn this to true. And I know that they are opposite, and I don't know why. And that's just, there's I'm sure you've encountered other places in Alma where you have this situation where one you're turning to true and one you're turning to false. But I'll just say, make sure you're reading the parameter key or looking at it in the documentation to make sure that the parameter value that you're putting in here is actually doing what you intend to. But this is one example where one is false and one is true, and that means for both that they're turned on. So just noting that. Um, and then you'd have to save this table in order to put that into place. I'm not going to change anything for that at this point, and I'm actually going to go back into my view. Um, But in terms of affecting other pieces of the basic search, you can also add some pre-filters to your basic search if you wanted to. So I'm in the view again, and I'm in the advanced search configuration tab actually. And we know that when we go into the advanced search, we have the option to choose the index that we're searching in, and we can choose material type here as part of our advanced search. If you wanted to retain that refinement in your basic search, you can do that. And in your advanced search configuration, you would just click on this, enable for basic search. And in this area of the view configuration, you don't have to save. So this is actually putting it into play. So when I refresh my Primo V page, what I will see is that under my search bar, I now have these refinements. So I can, do exact phrase title searches um, in my basic search also. And you can also add the material type refinement here as well. And it will appear here underneath your basic search. So if you're interested in that, it's just as easy as clicking this box. Um, in terms of refining advanced search, you do have the ability to make choices based on what indexes are available to search. So again, just looking at it visually, you can choose what indexes are available here and in what order they appear. Same thing with material type. You can remove material types or add them, especially if you've added local resource types. You can have them display here. And you also can choose what languages display in this dropdown. So in your advanced search configuration tab here, here are your list of indexes. So these aren't all the ones that are here by default. Some of them are here by default, like title and creator and that sort of thing. And you can see that some of them are deactive, like we don't have the course instructor index activated in this view. But if you did want to add an index, you could come over here. And if you had added a local index for faceting and searching, which we'll talk about in the local data session, you would see it here in the dropdown if it was configured right. You'd be able to choose its name. But you see, for example, I think some sites find it useful to have MMS ID as an index, for librarians to use in Primo V to pull up the exact bib. And if you wanted to use that, you could add that as a search index. And then you choose which search profile slots you want it to appear for. So for example, sometimes some of these search indexes are not as useful maybe for your course reserve scope. So you can leave it off of that, or you can turn it on for all, or any combination of these. And then you can add index. And then once you add it, you'd want to make sure that the slider was turned on to active. And then you can move them around, So if you wanted like creator to be higher than ISBN, you can use the up arrow, down arrow to move them around to the right order in the list. You can do the same thing with resource types. Some of these obviously are coming by default. Like I think most of these are probably enabled by default, but you can add additional ones just in the same way. You can choose your resource type from the list and then decide for which scopes it should be added to. The same thing is possible with languages, and these you can't add. I mean, these are coming from, maybe like ISO standards or something. But you have your list of languages, and I know for a fact that I haven't made any changes to this table because I haven't clicked customize. In some places in the Primo V view, you'll see if you haven't made any changes at all, you have to click customize before you can work the sliders. So if you do see this where you can't move something around, check to see if there's a customized option. Sometimes there is, and then that will release these in order for me to be able to turn on or off any of these languages appearing um, in the advanced search. Okay, so that's basic and advanced search. Um, we are going to move on to ranking and blending again at this point. Um, I know that we had looked at this previously, but we're actually going to make some changes in this environment to try and see what the results look like. Definitely the blending is going to make a big difference. The ranking in this sandbox environment hasn't made as much of a difference as I might expect, but we'll see what happens. So I've gone into the discovery menu under search configuration, and then we have ranking configuration here. So we saw this last week. This is where you can decide um, which fields you want to potentially boost if your search term appears in them. So we have title field has been boosted by a factor of 3.5, creator by a factor of 3. So we've made some choices there. And then we also have our date boosting where we can add dates or years of dates, and resource type boosting. And we can do the same thing, trying to boost different resource types. So let me see. Oh, okay. Let me back up for one thing before I get into this. I did want to show this before I left the views area. I'm just going to go back into the view again one more time to show one final thing related to ranking. Um, we looked at the personalization service last time we were here. The personalization service is the thing that allows you to choose your own disciplines that, are specific to your user that can help you with ranking. If you want to turn that on or off, that is in the view configuration. It's also in the general tab, and it's actually right under the autocomplete. You have your enable to personalize your results service. You can turn that on or off if you are interested in that. So that's one piece of ranking that I forgot to mention before we left the view config um, that you might be interested in.
Laura,
So in any case, I'm going to go back to.
we have a few questions about the advanced search
Sure.
configuration that you went over a little bit earlier. Um, One question we have is if the material type options can be uh, like changed, if you can remove certain material types, and also where to find the mapping table or code table that was shown. Uh,
Sure. So in terms of the resource types, you can disable them here. So if you didn't want to show, images, you can just toggle that off. And once you do that and you refresh your Primo V page, oops, um, you should see that the material type has been dropped from this list. You can also delete the whole row, I think. Um, Yeah, you can delete the row, but this will effectively remove it from the view. So it's probably fine just to toggle it off if you're interested in that. And the mapping table where we saw the controlled vocabulary service and the synonyms enable and disable, that's in the discovery config menu. So we're in Alma config under discovery, and then under other, which is like the final subsection here, there's the customer settings table, and then you open that, and then the easiest way to search for it is just to do a control F to find the settings there. And you have your synonym settings, and then I think towards the bottom you have this used controlled vocabulary search expansion set to true or false. There's a question, I saw just a question come through. Is there a resource type of ebooks? There is not. There is books, and you can create potentially a local resource type of ebooks. You can also create facets that use available electronic or available physical and resource type books to try and target that specific ebook collection potentially. Okay, so I'm going to go back into ranking configuration under our discovery config. And I'm just going to do a search for I'm going to go back to my simple search and do a search for virus. And I'm going to do a search on the library catalog just because I know that ranking is affecting only my local records. And I see in my result set that I have some older material in my local collection, and maybe this is an interesting topic to my library users right now. Um, so what I could try and do is do date boosting. This is already filled in because I've played around with it before, but I'll use this same configuration that I had, which is the range of years of 2010 to 2021. Boost that creation, those creation date years by a factor of 5. And then let's just see what happens. So here's how it looks. Let's see what happens to these results. I found that not a lot of change has happened in searches that I've been trying in this environment. Um, that might just be because of the results set that I get back. And what relevancy ranking I have for this particular search term in this environment. So I don't see a super big difference. Maybe some of these more recent material has been pulled up towards the top, but just to show that it does have some effect on ranking. It probably has more effect on ranking in your environment that has a significantly richer set of local data in it. And also to test multiple searches because again, relevancy ranking does play a role in how this is pulled back. So if you do one search and you don't see a lot of effect, it might have a more significant effect in some other search term. So just to sort of point that out, knowing that it's not a huge difference here. What does make a big difference is the blending, which we're going to look at doing the blending a little bit more here. And the blending is configuring the way that your local resources and your CDI resources work together when they're in the same scope. So we're going to go again to the search profiles under search configuration under our discovery menu, back to search profiles. And under search type here, you can always see what kind of search is happening. So is it searching the central index or is it searching your local data? And then the final option is blended. So if you have a scope that is searching both local and central index records, it will show up as blended. And this is the only search type that you can configure blending for. So you won't see this option for anything else. But if you do have CDI contained with some other scope, you are able to configure blending. And this is what comes by default. So that I haven't made any changes to this. So this is what you should see if you haven't made any changes to your blending. But let's just see what is there. So this is boosting our local records by a factor of 2.5. And it's boosting records with a medium score. So this is to do with Primo's relevancy ranking for local records. So if they're a medium match, and I know that this is kind of like approximation, what does high mean, what does medium, what does low mean? But a medium match, we're boosting by a factor of 2.5, and we're boosting potentially 5 local records, and we're boosting them to the top or second position, so the second record position in the first page of results in the everything scope. Okay, that's a lot of words. So for example, if I'm searching in my everything scope, which is blended, so it's containing both local and CDI records, what we see is that here in the top position, I have, this is a local record. So here's book, here's journal. These are coming from my local catalog. And then beyond that, it's all pretty much CDI, right? And so we have about 2 million results coming back. And we saw when I did a local search that there's about 84 local records that match this keyword. So what we're doing is we're boosting these local records up here so that there's eyes on them, so that they're not buried under the deluge of 2 million CDI results. So that's how it's set by default, and that's likely why you're seeing some local results being pulled up depending on your search term when you're searching in your everything scope, if that's what you have set up. To show what kind of an effect this has, you can also choose to deboost. So now we're demoting our local records by this tiny amount. And if we do that, this has a big effect on what we see. And when our results come back, we should see that now we don't have any local results in this first page. This is all coming from CDI, and likely, I mean, considering the number of results being pulled back at this point, likely our local results are hundreds of pages back. So it's just a way to be able to pull those, to give your local records a chance, basically, to be seen. I'm actually going to settings. You can also, you can mess around with the central index records. So this one isn't enabled. There's no deboosting or boosting for central index, but you can do the same thing for your central index records in your blended scope also. So you can make decisions about that. So there's nothing done here. But if you did want to give your central index records a boost or a deboost, depending on what you're doing, you could make those changes. And it's nice because it's only affecting this particular um, this search profile rather than with the ranking where we're affecting the entire institution. So it's a little bit more limited in scope. Okay, so I'm not sure if we want to go into restricted user groups and restricted search groups, or if we'd rather stop for questions. But I can go either way. I don't know if there's a lot of questions left to be answered. I think we have about
There are
6 minutes.
there are quite a number of questions.
Okay, let's stop and then we can always revisit restricted user groups if there's interest.
There's a question about which I know is something that is configurable or something that is taken into account for ranking, and that's they're asking if you can boost or deboost certain resource type, if you can configure how much weight is given. And I know that on that page that you are on, the ranking configuration page, that is one aspect that can be um, configured, or that you can adjust the weight of how much weight is given to a certain resource type.
Yes. Yes, you can choose your resource type here, and then you can choose a boost factor. Um, and you probably wouldn't want to use 10. But again, this is for your local records only, so it's not going to affect your CDI scope. Just delete that.
Yes, we have a follow-up. We have a question about that, whether the ranking configuration changes that are made here affect just local results, and that's correct, they do. And then we have a second question: does it also, or does it also alter the ranking of local results? For that, there's a separate uh, configuration. There's a separate page. I believe, did we review that in one of the previous sessions?
For CDI results,
Yeah, for like blended searches, how to determine how much um, results from one search engine are boosted or compared to another.
yeah, so for your blended results, you have the blending option where you
Mhm.
can, boost or deboost either local or central index records coming from these different sources. You don't have control over the ranking configuration of CDI in general. You have, control over it as it pertains to your local records when they're combined, but you don't have the option to do like a ranking configuration for CDI for like an
Mhm.
article scope, for example, that contains only CDI records. Um, that ranking structure is fixed. Let me see if I can grab the chat also. Um,
We have a question. If in a consortial environment, you can have a blended search of all institutions plus CDI. Yes. Um, so generally, in a consortial environment, you would have a discovery network scope, And if you have uh, in that profile that you've configured, if you have that discovery network scope and you have your central index scope, you can have all the results um, basically together. Results from those different search engines be returned together.
I might be able to demo that. Let's see. So you could choose your entire network scope, and then you could also choose the central index together. And you could create a search profile like that that's combining these two together. Yeah, and Manuela is noting that it's in the default also. I believe it's right here. This all records in the Discovery Network and your central index profile. So you could use this search profile in a search scope. Uh, so yeah, there's the question about the ebook search profile slot. You can use let me go back over here. You can use whoops, not there. In the custom local data scope, you can use the condition inventory available. Oh, it's not scrolling very well. You can use available electronic exists, and then you can add another condition where you're using the metadata resource type, and then you can limit that to books. And I think that that should pull back only books that are also electronically available, which should effectively be your ebook collection.
Someone else had asked if it's possible to set up a scope to search only articles in a certain or, or in specified e-journals, articles in certain specified e-journals. I don't believe there's a way to do that.
Yeah. I mean, it's possible that if you use that, add them to the collection discovery, maybe. Uh, that's not gonna affect your CDI results though. I mean, you could put your bibs there that you're getting from the community zone into a collection and then search that collection. You're not able to limit, if that was the question, like your
Mhm.
article level results. And I am at the hour. I want to be respectful of people's time and make sure that we end on time. And I'm going to stop the recording now. And I am going to grab the chat if there's anything that